Ave Maria Stella.
Hello and welcome back to Vatican II in a Year. This is your host, Father Matthew Schneider, a priest of the Legionaries of Christ and a theology professor. This is a podcast on the Star Christ Production Network at sqpn.com. Today we're on day 218, we're covering Apostolicum Exercitatum 17 on the need for individual apostolate. If you want to follow along, we have more details on our reading plan at sqpn.com/Vatican or frmatthewlc.com/Vatican. Yesterday we spoke about how there's a wide spectrum of apostolate, but it starts with individual lay apostles and then moves to group apostolates. Today we're continuing chapter 4, the various forms of apostolate, and we're speaking about individual apostolate, especially in places where priests and religious can't get, like under persecution or where the population is spread out. So let's read it. This is going to be a rather short day. So 17a is about individual lay apostolate, especially needed persecution. And B is about lay apostolate needed where Catholics are spread out. So let's get straight into 17a. There's a very urgent need for this individual apostolate in those regions where the freedom of the church is seriously infringed. In these trying circumstances, the laity do what they can to take the place of priests, risking their freedom and sometimes their life, to teach Christian doctrine to those around them, training them in a religious way of life and a Catholic way of thinking, leading them to receive the sacraments frequently and developing in them a piety, especially Eucharistic devotion. While the Sacred Synod heartily thanks God for continuing also in our times to raise up laypersons of heroic fortitude in the midst of persecution, it embraces them with fatherly affection and gratitude. If we think back to when this was written in the 1960s, so you had all of Eastern Europe under the Iron Curtain at the time, under communism, which was very much persecuting the church in a lot of those countries. If you want some examples of it, you can read a whole biography of John Paul II for an example of how it was happening in Poland, which is one of the communist countries at that time. Today, a lot of those countries have become free and not persecuting the church. Not all of them. Some of them still have some persecution, but we have a lot more persecution in the Muslim world, in parts of India, in parts of China, things like that. So we still have places in the world where this is super important because there's persecution. People sometimes talk about persecution in the West, in Western Europe, US, Canada, places like that. There isn't really persecution of this level. We're not saying that everything is perfect, but we are far from the kind of circumstance that this subparagraph is talking about. And there's a special importance of lay apostolate here because priests and religious are often more restricted. I, as a priest, I can walk around perfectly fine in the U.S., but in China, I'd be very restricted in what I could do simply because I'm a Catholic priest, much more than a random Catholic who also happens to be employing Chinese factory workers to make some doodads or something, or buying it from to buy doodads from some Chinese factory. They would have freedom of movement, freedom of expression that I wouldn't in China. And they can do a lot of things. They can teach, they can explain it, and they can do certain sacraments. If there's no priest around, you can baptize. If there's no priest around, no priest will come for an extended period. The exact debate can be set by the Bishops' Conference, I think. A layperson could also witness marriage. This is not a standard thing, but this is in extreme circumstances, like, say, some town is not likely to see a priest in the next 2 years. The people of the town could be the witnesses in place of the priest. And they can teach and evangelize, all those types of things. Obviously, they can't celebrate confession, they can't celebrate the Eucharist, things like that. You need a priest for those. And I think this is needed in our own society, not so much for this persecution, but this kind of attitude of indifference, this kind of aggressive secularism. And what we have today in this postmodern world is there's a certain kind of philosophical aspect that is kind of like, I say it, therefore it's true, and it's my truth, and there is no such thing as objective truth. There's just my truth and your truth. And what this leads to a lot of people is a very indifferent attitude, where religion is not about whether it's true or not, it's indifferent. It doesn't matter. It's not important. And that's something we have to respond to today, and we need lay people to do that too, because I can, as a priest, do somewhat, but I can't do a lot of it. So, moving on to 17b, lay apostolate near where Catholics are spread out. Let's read it. The individual apostolate has a special field in the areas where Catholics are few in number and widely dispersed. Here, the laity who engage in apostolate only as individuals, whether for reasons already mentioned or for special reasons including those deriving also from their own professional activity, usefully gather into small groups for serious conversation without any formal kind of establishment or organization. So an indication of the community of the church is always apparent to others as a true witness of love. In this way, by giving spiritual help to one another, through friendship and the communicating of benefit of their experience, they are trained to overcome the disadvantages of excessively isolated life and activity and to make their apostolate more productive. One thing that I personally think is in here is it's talking about spread out, and what is more spread out is not necessarily the amount of distance, but how easy things are to get to. I know, for example, in a certain place of rural Mexico where there aren't really sometimes there's just donkey trails, sometimes there's very dirt roads that you have to go very slow on and things like that. The Legion Regnum Christi has spent a lot of time training people to be catechists full-time or part-time in these small towns so that they can bring the people to Jesus, help explain it, things like that. And these towns, if we look at it on a map, we're like, well, that distance is that far. Our parish priest in rural Iowa or rural Ohio drives that between his parishes. Yes, but there's a big difference when you have a state highway you can go 50 miles an hour on, and when you have a donkey trail you can go 4 miles an hour on. The distance is not so much, but as far as physical distance, but how easy it is to get to. And so that's an important thing to think about here, because it's not always just physical distance. It is how easy it is to get there. Now, our society is not spread out, but this distance. But I think our society has a certain degree of siloedness where everything is just siloed in its own, where you have this workplace, that workplace. And there's not so much of those common elements, especially in a big city where each person, you go to your events of your particular hobby, you go to a particular workplace, and you end up being very siloed in all those different things, rather than what you'd have in a small town where it's more of like everybody together. And that's an important thing to think about, is that even though we're all close, we're all in many ways spread out in our connections. And here it notes the particular professional responsibilities. So those things like workplaces. I can't get into most workplaces. They just won't let me in unless sometimes if they invite me in to give a talk or something, because there's a Bible group that meets every week, and then once every quarter or something, they bring in a speaker over the lunch hour or something. That could be. But in most cases, no. And what it's saying here is you bring Jesus to each individual circumstance. It talks about groups discussing it, talks about friendship as those starting things, right? So we start with friendship. We start with groups of discussion. So groups of discussion, just something like a Bible study over lunch or a rosary group after work or things like that in your workplaces. And I think anyone who's listening to this, who's a layperson or even a not layperson, can organize something like that. I'm not saying this particular or that particular, but something along these lines. And that's important because all of us, lay people, priests, religious, are all called to be apostles by baptism, even the little kids. So thank you for listening to this episode of Vatican II in a Year. This is a listener-supported podcast, and you can donate to help StarQuest produce it, another great podcast at sqpn.com/give. You can give one-time monthly or join the StarQuest Patreon. Tomorrow we're going to continue with the next paragraph in Apostolicum Axiositatem, the next paragraphs, which is 18 and 19. On the apostolate is also together, so it's talking more about group apostolate. Please join us then to learn more about Vatican II, which provide a blueprint for the Catholic Church. If you want more information on the podcast, such as playlists for individual documents and a reading plan, go to sqpn.com/Vatican, frmatthewlc.com/Vatican, or Vatican SQPN on Facebook and X. There's also an SQPN Discord server at sqpn.com/Discord, and on that there's a channel for Vatican II in a Year. Amen.